Got it. All right, great. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today. My name is Rebecca Black, and I am the founder of Black Current, which is a boutique agency here in Toronto, where I'm currently based. And Black Current focuses on creating a more sustainable future. So thanks so much for joining me and the Ontario Cooperative Association today to learn more about the future, the potential of futures thinking, and strategic foresight. So in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, I'd like to open this space with a poem as a land acknowledgement. The poem is called Circles, One Inseparable from the Other, and it's written by my futurist colleague, Kathy Porter. Hearts, feet, land with beneath, long loved, not forgotten, Haudenosaunee. Settled amongst birch, ever vigilant, Huron-Wendat echoes call. Black willow whispers, ho, jiggy zanigan, old bones remembering. Water, standing trees, Mississauga's gathering, Anishinaabe call of living being kindness. We wish to acknowledge and remember that we are honored to hear the voices of the people who know this land to be their home. We wish to acknowledge and remember that settlers who came here and who come here were welcomed and are welcome still. We wish to acknowledge and remember that the harm of the first peoples, the keepers of this land, must stop. We wish to acknowledge and remember that if we do not see, do, think differently, nothing will change. So thank you for taking that moment with me to just consider where we are and the potential for Indigenous worldviews and Indigenous strategies to inform our vision of the future. So I mentioned that the team that works at Black Current is committed to working to create a more sustainable future. So we work with clients that are looking for solutions to climate change, solutions that are low carbon, that are equitable and socially just. So we spend a lot of time thinking about the future and ways to positively impact it. So our team of excellent and talented people have generated a lot of great work with amazing clients using a toolkit of marketing, design, strategic communication skills. But in the face of growing evidence of the climate crisis and social justice reports that's tracking this growing chasm between the haves and the have-nots, I had to wonder, as a professional, what more might we be able to offer our clients to help them achieve their goals? I felt keenly that we needed to make more impact. And in my search to find out what that might look like, I just discovered the potential for using a futures thinking lens to create more resilient solutions to the challenges and opportunities our society and our planet faces today for the future. So thanks to our hosts here at the Ontario Cooperative Association, I'm going to actually shorten that down to OCA for the rest of the presentation. Today, I'm excited to talk about an approach that we've used called strategic foresight. So strategic foresight is a design and innovation process that I came upon in my search for impactful tools for creating positive change. And it's one that I studied at OCADU in a master's program called Strategic Foresight and Innovation. That project just finished, that course just finished earlier this year. So my hopes for today is that you'll be encouraged to practice useful ways to think about the future and perhaps be curious about these tools that are available to be able to help you accomplish your dreams and realize your desired outcomes. So let's start with a basic premise. Change is inevitable. As humans, we're wired to frame change as a linear construct. We look to the past, we measure our experiences and what happens, and then we build out what we think will happen next based on those inputs. This is an evolutionary and useful process. But our reality is that the world is complex. It's becoming ever more complex. Change is not often predictable. Change sneaks up on us. If we just look at the past year and the effect that the pandemic has had on our lives, I think that's really clear. The pace of change is somewhat breathtaking. But foresight is about considering the changes that are happening, noticing them, and using a deliberate process to leverage what we're noticing to imagine possible futures. And strategic foresight places ourselves in these futures and asks, what if? What would serve this future? How could we reach our vision and our goals if these types of things happened? So foresight is a way in which we can build our plans, gain insights, and look for innovative possibilities. So today we'll look at the mechanisms, the flow of strategic foresight as a way of framing the future. And we'll walk through the journey that our hosts at the OCA took this summer in their own strategic planning process. And I'm excited that Erin Morgan, who's the executive director of the OCA, will join me for a Q&A and a discussion at the end of this presentation. So I encourage you to jot down any questions you might have or place them in the chat, and we will address those together at the end of this discussion. So when I say things do not unfold in a straight line, I'm intimately familiar with this statement. I'm absolutely not a stranger to disruption. A significant amount of my professional life was spent working in the music industry, not sadly as a talented creative artist, but in service of them working at music media and record companies. And the business model that funded my job was one of selling a musical product. In my era, it was selling CDs. That all came to an end about 15 years ago when file sharing became a new way of distributing music. And file sharing at the beginning was done by a very few number of people, and it was a laborious process. It took hours to upload tracks. But this was a sort of a signal of change, an indicator of change. And it took place at a time where the decision makers in the music industry really weren't that familiar with the internet. A lot of senior record company executives there, they had assistants print off their emails and they would write their responses. And in fact, not until the BlackBerry became sort of culturally an indicator of power, did they even access those types of digital communications in the internet on a regular basis. So when they saw this activity, this file sharing activity, they saw it as a distraction, a sort of outlier in the business model. What they didn't see or failed to consider were the bigger trends, that the capacity for information to be distributed by the internet was growing, the infrastructure was getting investment, and that this BlackBerry in their pocket was actually another signal of change, that things were going to change in terms of ways in which people communicated and received information. These were trends that could support and amplify these sort of satellite activities of file sharing. Now, I'm not going to go into a long story about the dematerialization of the music industry. It's pretty well documented and understood. And frankly, it's easy to look back and see what could have been. And I don't fault the leaders of that industry for missing the boat. But I was at the center of that story. And that disruption forced me and many other talented individuals to adapt to changes that felt random and beyond our control. And it doesn't have to be that way. We can approach the future differently. So we as humans have the capacity to look to and to plan the future, but we need to reach beyond a linear change model as our default. We can benefit from a more fluid and inclusive approach. And in times like now with ongoing disruption, it can feel overwhelming to try and see what might happen. There are so many things to consider. But conversely, in times of disruption, there's also more opportunity to build a future that you would desire. And a quote on the screen here, "The future we imagine is the future we create," is by a very established and well-known futurist, Stuart Candy. And he's right. Creating the future we imagine, though, requires intentionality and skill. And strategic foresight presents some structures and some tools to approach that exercise. So foresight asks that we see things differently. Things are changing, they're changing in all directions, they're changing simultaneously. Where does one start? Foresight starts by a process that we call horizon scanning. And it's when you look for and track a range of changes, and foresight categorizes those changes into trends, drivers, and signals. So trends, common phrase we sort of all understand. Trends are sort of things that we experience either through intentional research or just through noticing or observation. And they're related things that are happening in the same direction, maybe over the course of a year or two. So an example of a trend is today's online webinar and just the growth, the trend in using online platforms for connection, a trend that's obviously been accelerated by the pandemic. Drivers are the underlying conditions that support these trend activities. They're consistent, they're slower moving, they're much harder to change. So this idea of digital connectivity is a driver that supports the trend for us connecting online here today. Another trend that's supported by digital connectivity and the Internet of Things is working from home. And a lot of us are probably dialing in from independent spaces today. So drivers are the foundation. Trends are what we notice are happening. And then there are these curious things that futurists called signals. And signals are little shiny things that kind of catch our notice. The file sharing is a good example of a signal of change. And while it may not appear to be impactful in the short term, it's something that we instinctively recognize that if it grows, if it gains traction, it can actually have a huge impact on the future. So tracking these kinds of trends and drivers and signals forms a core activity for strategic foresight. It's really the bedrock of the process. And in order to be useful, the information that's being tracked needs to be drawn from a 360-degree sort of view of the world. And so I'm going to bust out the one acronym other than OCA that I'll use in this presentation is STEEP-V. STEEP-V stands for social change, social trends, technical, economic, environmental, political, and values-based trends. And that's the structure that futurists generally use in order to track their trends so that they're getting a complete view of the system in which we exist. So horizon scanning is the first step to organized future thinking. It's a discipline, though, that's not simply the domain of futurists. They're bound by a strategic foresight approach. Horizon scanning and that deep STEEP-V framework helps one to start to look at the system as a whole. And it's probably a practice that you're already doing in some capacity. But by formalizing it and making space for it in your professional routines, it's a way in which you can collect the ingredients to build possible and ideally even preferable futures, and to spot and identify the larger forces outside our organizations that are applying pressure to our day-to-day situations. Bouncing off this sort of foundational horizon scanning work, foresight employs a number of different strategic frameworks and tools that can help to put structure to the exercise. So some of these frameworks look really familiar, like a 2x2 plotting matrix, which we used at OCA, and I'll talk about a little bit later. Others are less familiar, things like plotting 3 horizons of growth and degeneration and status quo, and seeing where those end up and how the forces of change affect them. Things like digging down to root causes using causal analysis and flipping the worldviews to see how we might build out different futures. And even prescribed futures where we look at how these futures might end and add the trends in to see how they might get there. There's a range of possibility options to utilize. But all of them have one thing in common. Then they ask, what if we apply these diverse vectors of change? What impacts and outcomes might occur? What might these future scenarios look like? What opportunities might they present, or risks? And what needs to be true? So the foresight process uses these frameworks in order to inform imagining and innovation. So these discussions and resulting insights from workshops help to frame strategic innovations. So these are sort of design solutions that can leverage the trends we're experiencing, thrive in these possible futures, or adapt and be resilient in a range of futures. So I'd like to sort of double down on this idea of possible futures, because let's get real, we cannot predict the future. I'm aware of that. We can use what's happening now to frame the future. So what's possible? What's probable? What's preferable? And how might our actions today contribute to the preferable future? So when I reflect on my history in the music industry, I wonder how these types of scanning and immersive workshops and experiences might have helped us to imagine and shape more desirable outcomes. Okay, so that's my theoretical part of the talk. I'm just going to have a sip of water here. Today, I'm going to share how our hosts at the Ontario Cooperative Association use this strategic foresight process to gain innovative insights for their strategic planning exercise. Now, before I dive in, I just want to, you might wonder, like, how did this come about? How did strategic foresight as an emerging practice land with the OCA? And it's a happy result of a relationship between myself at Blackcurrant and the co-op sector. So in the interest of transparency, I'm a fan of co-ops. I'm a member of several co-ops. I'm an investor in co-ops through the purchase of community bonds. And I'm a director on the board of the Trek Renewable Energy Co-op. So I'm a fan. And alongside my research associate, Steph Rebello, and we had the good fortune to work with Trek on a strategic foresight exercise as part of our major research project at school. And for future Trek, we designed a process that employed strategic foresight to create an innovation portfolio for the co-op. One of the people that was involved in that research project was Chris Caners, who's the executive director of the Solar Share Co-op. And he's also a member of the board at the OCA. So he saw an opportunity to practice strategic foresight for the OCA's 2021 planning process. So we were delighted to be invited to support a sector that we're passionate about and believe in. And alongside my colleague, Yana Koritek and Aaron as the ED, we designed a strategic foresight process with 3 desired outcomes in mind for the OCA. The first was that the OCA would actually practice this new skill, learn about this new skill of futures thinking and strategic foresight. The second was that the association would actually gain useful insights that would be able to inform the strategic planning process. And then the third was that the results of the process would be insightful to the entire co-op community, hence my speaking with you today. Okay, enough about that. Let's get down to the nitty-gritty. What did we do? So the process kicked off by setting the future that the OCA wanted to create and placing their community within it. And we did this by setting a guiding question for the future. What might be the role of co-ops to build a resilient and equitable future in Ontario? So this question was sufficiently broad and inclusive to allow for a range of possible futures to apply, but it was also bound by the values of the cooperative movement. So it included resilience and equity and inclusivity. And this question was useful because we turned to it many times as a North Star as we worked our way through the subsequent phases of the strategic foresight process. Now, as researchers, of course, Yana and I wanted to get up to speed with what the OCA was all about. So we started by conducting a stakeholder mapping session to learn from the OCA team about who was in the sector, but not just that, what were their interconnections? What were the influences around key actors? So the mapping, of course, is an important foundational step for taking a more human-centered design approach to innovation, to try and deeply understand what key actors are doing, what they're thinking, how they're feeling, and to gain a better view of how to actually solve people for their situations and their problems on the ground. So in our case, we were particularly interested in a sort of systems level view of participants in the OCA ecosystem and how to access their diverse perspectives, because our next step was going out and speaking with the community. So their input and their lived experience could steer the horizon scanning exercise. So we wanted to hear from a diversity of perspectives, and we scheduled a number of calls to ask people in the cooperative sector probing questions specific to the horizon scanning job. So we asked them, what were the trends that were influencing their co-op experience, be it co-op development, participation and member engagement, policy, finance, what was influencing them right now? What were the challenges and opportunities that they felt were happening right now? So really getting on the ground of the sector. And of course, we had ongoing dialogue with Aaron and the staff at OCA and the team. So their input contributed to the scanning process as well. And throughout this process, we started to track and build key insights that emerged through these conversations. These insights were about the OCA as an organization, the co-op community, and then of course with the horizons scanning the world at large. And they were employed later on in the process in a sense-making exercise that we'll touch on. So 9 very dynamic and interesting and different interviews later, we had a long list, over 125 trends that emerged from our conversations. And so Jana and I sorted and grouped those trends using that steep V sort of analysis and categorization framework to identify those that we heard were most impacting the co-op sector. And then we filled in some gaps. In that 360-degree view, there were trends that emerged that were very clearly impacting the sector, but there were also gaps and trends that are really impacting our sector or our world right now, but that weren't on the radar in the conversations that we had had. So the result was a trend guide, and that was shared with the board and the staff. And I'm looking forward to sharing it with everybody on this webinar as well, in hopes that it could be a useful guide and interesting to you, sort of a thought exercise for your co-op or your organization to consider how these trends are pressuring and influencing your present and into the future. There we go. So next up was to employ a strategic foresight framework to build out possible futures. And as I mentioned, there's a number of different ways in which to approach this exercise. We chose a 2x2 mapping process, and we chose it for a few reasons. One is we really wanted to have 4 very distinct, a number of different diverse futures to play in later in the process. And we knew that this was a good way of getting to 4 very diverse futures. It's also a relatively common framework that people use to map things 2x2. And so we felt as a group that was just beginning in foresight that we would use something that was more familiar rather than trying to bring a more complex or less familiar mapping tool to the table. And also, in the interest of transparency, our team is quite new at Foresight, and we had used this mapping, 2x2 mapping framework for Trek and for a number of other Blackcurrant clients, and we'd had really great results. So we felt confident that this was a good way forward. So the OCA staff spent 2 hours in a facilitated session mapping the trends that had emerged through the horizon scanning across these 2 axes. And the axes are 2 critical uncertainties that we drew from that overarching question, the idea of economic recovery and inclusivity, and the idea of equity and increased participation and representation in the community. So the process mapped the trends, where the trends would thrive. What were the conditions given these 2 critical uncertainties where these trends would thrive? And some of the trends would thrive just in one area. Others, they existed in multiple areas. And what you can see in the background of this slide is the resulting map from the process. So I have to hand it to the OCA team that they were really involved and engaged every step of the way and trying these sort of new and unfamiliar activities. So it was, as a facilitator, incredibly fortifying to have that level of engagement, to have thoughtfulness and participation. And we tried to facilitate that by providing materials in advance and generally keeping ourselves organized, but it was super fun. Trying to move to the next one. There we go. So using the resulting quadrants of that 2x2 map, Jana and I then had the pleasure of incorporating the trends into possible future scenarios. We picked 10 years, 2030, anything shorter when we're really looking at incremental change. So we pushed out the change by 10 years. This is a creative process. I find it a lot of fun, but really it hinges on making sure that the 4 futures that we created are sufficiently diverse to offer measurably different environments in which to explore strategic options and innovations. So it was really important to push out 10 years and try and get take those trends as far as they could go in order to be able to have a generative exercise and conversation later about what solutions might look like in those space. We developed a workbook with a write-up of the scenarios for the staff and the board to read and absorb, because the next thing that they were going to do is they were going to visit these futures and they're going to revisit the question that we had posed at the start of the journey. And we actually evolved the question, so what kind of impact would the co-op model have in each of these future scenarios? And I have to say some rather lively conversations ensued. And those conversations unearthed a lot of really diverse perspectives on how the trends that had surfaced during the research might play out for co-ops and might play out for society in a 10-year period. The reaction to their futures was very emotional. I think there was a lot of strong reaction. It was mixed. Some of these future scenarios struck some of the participants as really undesirable. Others saw grains of opportunity there and saw them as more positive. The goal of the exercise isn't to create a desired future. It's really about possible futures, incorporating the trends to underpin the scenarios with things that are real now and could possibly grow. And these scenarios also incorporate counter trends, right? The complete opposite of what we measured might be happening, but is still happening on the ground today. So how might those play out? It's really an imaginative and exciting exercise to be living in these future scenarios. So at the end of the session, we had a lot of content that helped to inform some key insights that we felt would be useful for the strategic process. And this was this sort of sense-making exercise. So throughout the journey with the OCA, we had practiced ethnographic skills, I guess, active listening, making sense of the process. And we kept a lot of notes to be able to really help us unpack some of the insights that might help OCA make innovative and unique decisions. And so by insights, we mean learnings that emerged as an interpretation of our observed behavior, what people were saying, what they were not saying, what they were doing, or how they were feeling. And an insight in itself, of course, isn't positive or negative, nor does it embody a specific course of action, but it's useful to answer some big questions that are posed in the strategic process. So some key insights that we shared with the staff was that OCA as an organization was really committed to transformational change. That this wasn't about how do we tweak this or tweak that. Transformational change was the goal and the glue that held this organization together, gave it purpose, energy, and focus. That the co-op community, as diverse as it is, and as working in its own sectors and in some cases silos, there was really a shared and similar challenges that ran through the community of co-ops. And that the larger disruptive world, while seeming sort of overwhelming in some ways, is an environment that's rich for change and influence and impact by the co-op sector. So we shared those insights with the staff in the spirit of uncovering what might be the strategic value of those insights, how might they influence or enable or disable strategic direction. So another rich conversation ensued, providing food for thought for the executive team at the OCA as they designed the annual strategic planning session that the board undertook just a few days ago on Friday. So for that workshop, the board was presented with a new innovative concept for the OCA that was generated by the strategic foresight journey. And it was a combination of insights from the process, conversations with members and other key stakeholders, consideration of the core values, and an innovative leap that Erin took, who was able to juxtapose what she was hearing with what was being learned to find new ways to frame solutions for the co-op sector in the future. And so the concept involves OCA becoming a hub for inter-co-op collaboration to bring transformational change to Ontario. So the hub idea actually builds on a number of trends and drivers and signals that are happening now, both to cooperatives and by cooperatives. It answers what the process unearths as meeting the needs of core stakeholders. It resonated with this internal drive for transformational change. And so presenting this idea as a possible strategic innovation, the board on Friday dove into a workshop to explore it further. And so the workshop utilized tools developed through the foresight process, and it critically looked at the opportunity to analyze it and iterate it by considering the effects of trends and drivers on the concept and by wind tunneling the concept in future scenarios. And so the wind tunnel metaphor takes the metaphor looks after an instrument that's used in engineering to test whether prototypes can withstand different highly erratic conditions like strong winds. So in the board activity, our prototype was the co-op hub strategy. And the environmental conditions came in the form of these future scenarios that have been built out for the team. So the outcome wasn't to force fit the idea into the futures, but it was to pull it apart, really, to reveal potential risks, to look at opportunities, to see how the idea might be augmented in order to thrive or be resilient in these possible futures. So once again, lively conversations ensued in which the board and breakout groups took the idea to task, really amplified the trends and the futures to consider the impacts and the opportunities. And the outcomes of the board workshop have set the stage for future exploration of the co-op hub strategy. So that brings us to now, to the present. So what ground has the OCA covered? So in their strategic foresight exercise, the OCA has mapped its community, engaged its community. It's built upon their insights and their input to consider a diversity of trends that are in play right now, ones that are worth noting and ones that might have escaped their notice. And then building on this foundation of trends to help create possible futures, they used insights from the process to inform a solution that could leverage these vectors of change and meet community needs in the future. As a facilitator, a very happy outcome. This process produced an innovative solution designed to help move co-ops in the OCA towards a more resilient and equitable future. And it answered the goals that we had set at the beginning, which is having new practices for the OCA board, staff, and community, having new insights into innovative solutions, not just this one idea, but a range of insights, and then sharing these types of learnings with the community. So the process has been really energizing and generative. And what I'd like to do now, first of all, thank you so much for allowing me to recount that story. I'm having a hard time actually sharing my next slide. But I'd like to invite Erin Morgan to join me for her feedback and thoughts on the strategic foresight process. And then we'll move into a broader discussion. So please have your questions ready and drop them into the chat. So maybe I'll just stop sharing. Oh, there we go. Look at that. But I am going to stop sharing regardless. And I would love to hear from Erin. I'm sure the audience is interested in how your experience and your view of the process went. So opening the floor for you to share your experience with the group.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yep, okay. Sorry, I have technical difficulties, so I have to use my phone for a mic, and sometimes you can't hear so well. So the overall, the experience was of jumping into the deep end, which, you know, as somebody who's worked in strategic planning, you know, in roles that have involved strategic planning for most of my career, finding something new and where you feel like you don't know what's coming next and you're not 100% sure how to participate so that your participation has value. That's new, you know, for me. I almost felt like I was learning all over again, which kept it fresh, which kept me really engaged and really interested for the entire time. And it also kept me on my toes because I didn't always feel comfortable that I was giving the right answer, even though there probably wasn't a right answer. You know, I would answer a question and then one of either you or Yana would sort of challenge that answer and ask me from a different perspective, a different angle. And so all those things that you think you know, they get challenged in a new process like this, which I think in the end worked out amazingly. But while we were in it, it was a process of getting comfortable with my own discomfort throughout the process.
For sure. I mean, certainly when I was learning these frameworks and practicing them for the first time, there was this sense of, is this a real thing? Like, it seems so unusual to how we generally plot things and then extrapolate. And that's our comfort zone because that has worked for us. But being able to really diverge out into these ideas of how all these influences might go, and then pick out opportunities there, it's an unusual experience. I'm hoping it will become more practiced. I wonder if you heard from your staff and your board, like, how did they respond to the process?
Well, for everyone, it was a trust exercise. It was very much like that trust circle where you like fall back and hope someone's going to catch you. You know, you trust in the process, not knowing what the outcome's going to be. And I think everyone felt that sense of discomfort at first, you know, not quite clearly understanding what they were supposed to do to participate correctly. Everybody wants to participate in a process correctly. They want to add value to the process. And when you're not sure, when this is the first time you've done something, there is a sense of discomfort. But I think what that meant was that people were more engaged than they would have been if it was something that they'd sort of been there, done that before. We're just following the same path and checking the boxes. I think a little discomfort meant for everybody to be more engaged. And so, you know, staff were asking more questions about, you know, how does this work? Why do we do it this way? How come we're, you know, and that 2x2 matrix for the staff was definitely, you know, all of us were struggling to figure out what box to put the trends in. And it meant that everybody was able to discuss what direction, like the angle that they were bringing to it. And it meant for there was some really great discussion because everyone was a little hesitant to sort of put a trend in one quadrant. It made everybody sort of talk about their assumptions, where maybe in a different exercise we wouldn't be bringing up all of the assumptions behind why we were doing something. We would just put it there and then move on. Yeah. So it was really good from that perspective. And I know that for a board member coming from one organization where you wear a hat at say the Cooperators or Gately Foods, and then and you think about that organization's, you know, strategic planning from that perspective, and then you have to put a different hat on at OCA because the goals are different. You know, I know that that's challenging as well for all board members. And so, you know, I'm really grateful for their full participation and their willingness to work through the process from sort of work through a new process with us.
Yeah, I mean, our experience as facilitators is that this is a really challenging process. And as I mentioned during the presentation, like the level of energy and intentionality that the board and the staff and yourself as their fearless leader brought to the process was really fortifying. It requires letting go a little bit of what we think we know and using imagination and to a certain extent some instinct. And again, that's something that we often don't consciously practice. We sort of don't think that through. So I think your feedback is very similar to other groups and experiences, that there's a certain letting go, there's a certain sense of adventure. And as facilitators, in fact, we design the process and it's an emergent process for us as well. So based on what we hear and from your community or what the results of the workshops are, there are many different ways in which that information can be used. I think it's important to note that foresight isn't a sort of one and done type of exercise. I mentioned that horizon scanning is something I think we all kind of do naturally anyway. We're always looking, you know, we've got our Google News alerts and this, that, and whatever. But by putting some intentionality around that and actually having, you know, even a regular sort of touch base on what have we heard in the last quarter, you know, and what might that mean moving into the future? How might that reflect upon the plans that we're working on? And really having that curated sense of curiosity to be able to touch base and build more resilience into the types of ideas that you're working on. If anybody has any questions for Erin or for myself, please feel free to pop them in the chat. I don't know about the hand putting up thing. That's also fine. If anybody wants to raise their hand, I imagine that'll pop up on our screen, but we'd love to hear if there's any questions from the group. I have some more questions for you, Erin, if that's okay, while we're waiting to see if there's anything from the group. What surprised you the most about this? What, if anything, surprised you about this process?
Well, the biggest surprise for me was how outside of my comfort zone I felt, but that was good. That was a very good thing about the exercise. The other thing was, I think that what surprised me most was how far we journeyed in a short time. And, you know, when we started this process, we were in the thick of the pandemic. Everyone was at home. No one was going into the office. Our board included, we still are having meetings on Zoom. And so we were already living in a really disrupted time. And then to be talking about the future in this disrupted time, you go into the process without expectations, because it's hard to have expectations. It was just hard last year in the sort of winter time to have any expectations at all, because the world was so uncertain. And so talking about the future in such an uncertain world, it felt like a fool's errand. Like it just felt like there's no way we could possibly end with something concrete, because nothing feels concrete. And so we went into the process to give ourselves a new way of looking at the future, because the world was so uncertain. It felt like a good time to do it. And to have landed in a place where we feel hopeful and optimistic and filled with energy for the future and for an idea. I mean, I think that's the best possible scenario, but and you hope for that, but you're also surprised when you get there.
That's such a great answer. Thank you for that. And I really feel what you're saying about functioning this within a pandemic environment. There's been so many challenges, and I wonder how different even the trends that people are mentioning and what they're noticing would be different if we were at a time pre-pandemic, or maybe a couple of years from now, when it's not quite as things haven't been quite as disruptive, and we'll see. So thanks, Jody, for your question. Can you place this process in the context of an annual strategic planning process? Is this something you would recommend groups open up with or end with for an extended planning process over a couple of days, for example? That's a great question. Erin, would you like to answer that from the perspective of a client and your experience? And then I'd be happy to layer on that. Yeah.
Okay. So OCA is coming to the end of a 5-year plan. And we had a lot of conversation between the staff and the board about 5-year planning time horizons anyway, and whether that was a useful time horizon. And our experience with the previous 5-year plan was that the world was changing too quickly and our plan changed, sort of multiple times over that 5 years, and that shortening our time horizon would be helpful. So that's where we started. We said, okay, we're going to look at a 3-year sort of rolling plan where, you add you're almost perpetually strategic planning. So we sort of built that in, and we kicked off our strategic planning process, this new sort of 3-year time horizon, by having a conversation about our original 3 overarching goals at OCA, which was to be the voice of cooperatives and to help facilitate the cooperative principles, and then deliver cooperative solutions both to our members and to new cooperative businesses. So we talked about whether those were the right ones. And then Chris suggested this futures opportunity, this foresight process to us. And it sounded like the perfect opportunity, because we were in a really right now we're in such a time of flux with the whole pandemic and back when we started, we were even more in flux about what the world was going to look like, what economic recovery was going to look like. What we knew we wanted to be a leader in economic recovery. We knew in Ontario the cooperative model could be really transformational in economic recovery, but we needed to go through some sort of a process to wrap our heads around where the opportunities lay. And Rebecca and Jana's sort of foresight process seemed perfect for that moment in time. And so if you're in a time of transition as an organization, and which is where we were, I mean, I'm sure Rebecca can tell you how you can apply it other times, but for OCA, we were in a time of transition and dealing with a lot of change around us. And the foresight process was extremely helpful to really take stock of everything that was impacting us and allow us to go through a process that was almost grounded in that change, so that we could digest it and think about it in a way that moved us ahead.
Yeah, I think that's thanks for sort of recapping that. The horizon scanning is a discipline that I think could be continually practiced, but when it comes in the context of an annual strategic planning process, there's a number of ways in which you could approach strategic foresight. And it would take some preparation to be able to build it into a short-term type of, like a 2 or 3 day, you talked about a tour over a couple of days. There's a number of ways in which it can be approached, but there is heavy lifting at the front in terms of horizon scanning. And that is something that I would encourage everybody to do. So when it comes to actually using those insights, so those trends to look at how it might affect the future, there are a number of different ways in which it could be approached. So it could be approached as a kickoff to sort of open up mindsets, open up possibilities, open up possible futures. It could be used as to test ideas. So we've got these ideas of what the future might look like. We've got some ideas on what we might want to work on. How do these actually persevere in those futures? So there's a number of ways in which it can be approached. And I think it's quite a flexible process, but like any strategic planning process, it needs to be done properly. And so leaving the time and the resources to be able to do that is, I think, really, really key. Thanks, Kathy Stewart. I hope, Jody, that's helpful for you. I mean, thank you. We are going to share the trend deck, and maybe that's just an interesting thing to take a look at and think about how those trends might influence you as a start off. And I will be sending out my contact information. I'd love to hear from you if you want to talk about the ways in which this process can be used strategically by your organizations. So thanks also to Kathy Stewart as a new board member. She found the process interesting, thinking outside the comfort zone. And that's great that she's excited that we're heading into with where they're heading after this strategic planning process here. So it's 10 to 1. So I think I'm gonna wrap up today's session. I wanna start, of course, by thanking Erin and the OCA team and the board, not just for the opportunity, which was really great, a great opportunity for us to play out these phases of the process. And we started speaking in February and we started acting in March, April. And so it has been a relationship that's been built out and it's been really fortifying. And I hope we'll continue to work together to help sort of deepen the design of these new innovation ideas. I also want to take a time to just acknowledge Jana Koritek and Steph Rebello. They've been my 2 partners on this project. They are both incredibly smart collaborators, designers, and practitioners of foresight. Couldn't have done it without them. And so I hope that today's session has actually presented the opportunities for futures thinking to you and perhaps sparked your interest and curiosity in how it might work for you, that it can help us all build a more beautiful, just, and healthy future. So thanks very much and take care.
Thanks everybody for joining us.